Who are the characters behind science? This is Science Behind the Glass, illuminating the human side.
In this podcast, we unveil the human side of laboratories and science. Scientists share personal experiences and we discuss their meanings from different perspectives and fields of research.
Every 2 weeks, a language dies with its last speaker. When a language disappears, we don't just lose words, we lose stories that cannot be translated, medicines that have no other name, ways of loving, grieving, and understanding the universe that exists nowhere else on Earth.
Awa, thank you for accepting this invitation, Science Behind the Glass. It's a pleasure, it's an honor having you here. We can't wait to hear about you. So please introduce yourself. Tell us about you, your background. Tell us anything, okay?
I'm Awa Puketapu, it's my name. I live in a little community called Waitangi in a place called Lower Hutt, and which is in New Zealand, for those of you who don't know where Waitangi and Lower Hutt are. I am Māori, which is the indigenous culture here in New Zealand, and I come from the tribes of Ngāti Ruapani, which has just had a formal apology from the government for its breaches of our treaty settlement, for breaches of the treaty, but also from the tribes of Te Atiawa and Ngāi Tuhoe, which is also by Ngāti Ruapani.
Yeah. Excellent. And can you tell us a little bit more about the Māoris and the treaty that they have with the government, with the New Zealand government for Aotearoa?
Yeah. So Māori have been here for a long time. By 1840 in our country, we were a lot of these British sailors and whalers had come to New Zealand, and before that, and in 1840, there was a treaty of we call it the Treaty of Waitangi that was settled or written between the British and Māori, so between our chiefs and the representatives of the Crown. And that treaty, there's a lot of misconception about the treaty because there's different interpretations, I should say. There's the Treaty of Waitangi and Te Tiriti of Waitangi. But essentially, from Māori perspective, it was about the lawlessness of the British in our country and a way to, encourage the British to take care of their own people and control their people. So that was part of it. But essentially, we have a Treaty of Waitangi that was put in place as a way for us to live together in this country and in harmony and in reciprocity with each other. So that was signed in 1840, and we have a person in our family who's about 4 or 5 generations before who was actually one of the signatories of that treaty here in Wellington, who signed it in April 1840. But February the 6th is the day that's generally celebrated here.
Right.
And it's called the Treaty of Waitangi because it was signed in Waitangi. There's a place up north.
And something that I was learning, and it was interesting about this treaty, is that actually the translation wasn't really reliable translation. And the British were being truthful.
Yes.
So they were trying to take your sovereignty away.
Yeah.
So, and that is the core of why I want to touch base about the languages.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about why the language is so important and how this can be misunderstood?
Yeah. There's a word, I guess, in the Treaty of Waitangi. So there's, which is the word kāwanatanga. And the way that word was, actually, no, it wasn't the kāwanatanga, it was rangatiratanga. And the way in which that word is interpreted from our lens is not the same way in which it's interpreted from the British or from the English language. So, and that word has been, I guess, because of that misunderstanding, that word has created quite a division in New Zealand for the last 185 years about whether or not Māori ceded sovereignty or not. And so I don't believe that my grandparents or my family who signed that treaty, or any of those chiefs who signed that treaty at that time, signed a treaty with the intention of giving anybody else power, sovereignty, or anything like that. I don't believe for one second that that was anything, and I don't believe that happened anywhere in the world.
Mm.
And when we think about New Zealand was probably the youngest country to be colonised. I think the practice of colonialism by that time was very well practiced. They were very good at it. And so it was very, in my view, and I'm not a treaty expert at all, but it was very intentional what they were doing. And our understanding of that was just not the same. Mm. And so for me, that's understanding words and meaning of words. I don't think you can never really get the right meaning across languages in specific words. And so the essence of words in our own language is quite critical to know, because it's not easily translatable across cultures.
Yeah, it doesn't have the same meaning.
It doesn't have the same meaning.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, because the Maoris are being one of the few indigenous that have like this sovereignty compared to other countries. For example, in Colombia, the indigenous groups and tribes, they have in the constitution, they have the sovereignty over the lands. But one thing is having it on the paper, yeah. And the other one is like how it actually works. Mm. And something that is very interesting is that you were equals with the government after so many battles and setbacks and coming and forward and backwards. But then also something that was interesting is that in 1980s, your language was started to becoming extinct because the government was prohibiting in the schools. Mm. So the kids weren't able to speak the Māori language. But then it came as this big movement, which your grandmother was part of that. And then you were one of the first ones in this big movement. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Kōhanga Reo, that is a language nest?
Yeah. I think before I go there, I think it's important to also point out that the intent of the Treaty of Waitangi with the Te Atiawa of Waitangi was about a partnership, an equal partnership. But that's not how Māori have felt in the last 185 years, and the amount of breaches that there have been. And if we have a look at our statistics and all of the health statistics, all of the justice statistics, Māori are so much more overrepresented representative in those statistics. I think it's important to point that out, that the notion and the intention of that Treaty of Waitangi, we are still at the other end of that. But yes, you're right in regards, and I guess post-signing the treaty, laws were put into place. For example, there was a law that came into place called the Tohunga Suppression Act, which was a law that stopped our elders and our we call them tohunga, but our experts in medicine. So we weren't able to practice our own medicinal and healing practices because of this act. And if we go back to the Treaty of Waitangi, that was one thing that should have been protected. Mm. But laws continue to come in place to stop that from happening. The same thing with the schools. There was the Native Schools Act that was put in place in 1868, I think. So only 28 years or so after the signing of the treaty. That meant that my grandmother, for example, who attended a native school could not speak Māori, and so she would have to learn English and go home and speak Māori, and corporal punishment was allowed. And so these are some of the breaches and the very deliberate moves that took place as a practice of assimilation and a practice of colonialism towards our people, even with the treaty. But we were lucky in the 1960s, and I know I want to talk about my grandmother, but I have to start with my grandfather. He actually went to, I think it was a university in Chicago, and he did some study over there, and he actually think he lived over there for a while. And one of the things he was really interested in was, through his observations, was how he would watch some of the children who were trilingual. They would be speaking in English and in there. It may have been, I'm not sure which American Indian tribes they were, but just this fascination of how these children could speak in 3 languages. And I think that sat with him for a long, long time. And when he came home, obviously in New Zealand as well at that time, there was the language, our Māori language was on the brink of being, of going. And there were some reports that were put out at that time that basically said if we don't do anything about the language, we're going to lose the language. And so the whole of New Zealand, well, people, not the whole of New Zealand, but people who were interested in language revitalisation came together. There were marches and there were meetings held across the country where they pulled together all of the elders and talked about what was the action that was going to be taken to respond to the fact that our language was going to be lost if we didn't do anything about it. And that was around the late 1970s. So I'm not saying that I guess for my grandfather, seeing that it could be done in another country, seeing that that was something that would be also great. We have this issue here in New Zealand, and how can we work together collectively as well? So that's not the reason, but it was his
inspiration for that.
Inspiration for also wanting to be a part of the movement alongside so many other people. So they did that, and they had a meeting. One of the big meetings they had here was in our marae in Waitangi, where they all agreed that they would do something and put together a language nest. And there was an old man there, well, I shouldn't call him an old man, a kaumātua. His name, Te Atiawa, and he gave the name of the Kōhanga Reo, and which is essentially, Kohanga is a nest, the bird's nest, and Reo is the language, so the nest, a language nest. And that's really where the Kohanga Reo movement grew out of. And they opened the first language nest up in 1982 here in Waitangi, which is what my grandmother and another grandmother as well were involved with. They would travel around New Zealand and try and encourage communities to look at this, we need to do this. And we were lucky to have the first one open here in Waitangi. The second one quickly followed, which was at Waiwhittu Marae. And then they started opening up around New Zealand.
Yes, and it was like a big movement.
It was a huge movement.
A huge movement. And then when you grew up, you spoke your language?
Yeah. So I was lucky to attend the Kohanga. So my first language is Māori. That was my grandmother would only speak to me in Māori up until I was about 16. And it was probably quite a risk as well. Because I do remember a story. She used to say that she would go to jail. If she needed to go to jail for the fact that she was teaching Māori to children, she would do that. That was a sacrifice that not just her, but I imagine so many other people were willing to make. And I think about the generation before, my mum's generation and my partner's generation, as parents. They're the parents who never got the language, but skipped. And so I think there was a big sacrifice that they had to make for us. And so those of us who came, so many of us had the language that our Māori is our first language, but not necessarily being spoken to in the homes. I was lucky that I did have the language spoken with home. But it's been a journey. It's been a massive journey.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, for example, when they came with this big movement and to keep and preserve your language, and also some that inspire others, because this went worldwide. And then not only, but in Hawaii and in Canada, and the Mohawk language that was getting extinct, but then same as your grandfather got the inspiration from Native Americans, they replicate the same. I want you to tell me a little bit why the language is the way that we see our world. My native language is Spanish. And sometimes for me, it's very difficult to write about like a literature or poetry in another language, because I don't feel that is the same. It's not easy. Not only because I can get the words, but it doesn't come in the same way. I guess that is the same for Māori. I want you to tell me what is the biggest differences, for example, when we just use one single language, in this case, English, and why this is homogenization of the languages can be a risk of just oversimplifying and losing the meaning of the world.
Yeah. Gosh, that's such a big question, because I often, when I think about how I might put some words together in Māori, I think about it from quite a descriptive way of looking at the world, trying to describe the scenario. And there's a lot of metaphor and a lot of analogies that's used when we speak the language, whereas I find like when you use the English language, of course you can be metaphorical or analytical and all those things, but for me, when you speak Māori, when I hear other people speaking metaphor, I think that's what makes Māori language really beautiful, is the metaphorical and oratory that sits behind how we speak or how it's spoken. And it's so beautiful because the language taps into, we can be talking about, we draw on analogies about the forests and about the oceans and about the land and about all of the our natural environments, and that's just, and even about our own sort of non-English, non-Māori people call them demigods, but we have our own gods, and so I think that sets a platform for just a completely different way of seeing the world and speaking. Whereas, and it's quite hard to even translate. Sometimes from English, you might say something, you say that in reverse in Māori. So it's a,
it's a feminist part.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have to think like, what is the order?
Yeah. So, and it's, it's just, and the language is evolving. And there are a lot of, and that's great. I think languages have to evolve and become quite contemporary, and that's great. And at the same time, there's this other part of the whole language, which is just amazing. Mm.
Yeah. And something that, do you think that in the way that we speak our language is also the way that we relate with our environment? Like, for example, in the Western society, we don't immerse or include nature in our language.
Yeah.
That's because we see it as a third party.
Yes.
But how is it Māori? How
Yeah.
is it different?
Yeah.
That way?
I would say it's the same. Like, it's quite hard to separate out yourself as an individual from your whole world or from your surroundings. And I think there's also something about, how do I say this without generalizing? I don't want to generalize, but I think Indigenous cultures, particularly Māori, we move as collectives. And so we also, our living and the way in which we see the world, we have our own family structures that don't necessarily replicate English family structures, for example. We don't, and that forces us to not think about ourselves as an individual, but to think about collective. And I think that also then impacts how we speak and how we see the world and what we draw on in regards to how we choose to have conversations. Because, again, I'm not a doctor, I know nothing about brains, but I can't help but think that impacts how we think and therefore how we speak. So, yeah, there's a massive, I think.
That you mentioned of thinking as a collective is very important, because I think that our language and one of the problems that we have is that individuality. Yes, we are individual, we have our individuality, but we don't think as a collective.
Yeah.
And when we don't think as a collective, we can't see, for example, protecting a forest as a collective. We just something a third party, not as a whole. If we don't protect a forest, then we are not going to get the water from the rivers. We are not going to be protected all together. Which it goes into my other question, that is, how do you relate with nature? Now you said that it's a collective, but how do you relate with nature? It's like I know that it is different, but I want you to explain me not like an individual or a third party, or we are over them. How do you, as Māori, see nature?
I think it's probably fair to say that for again, I don't want to generalize about Māori because I don't want to be speaking for all Māori, but my experience and my world as being a Māori person here is nature is, so if I was to go into the forest, and I used to practice this always as a kid, I just thought it was second nature. It's just what I had to do. I'll never go into a forest without first saying prayer. And I'd never go into a forest without, I'd never break a branch off a tree. I'd never deliberately damage a tree without doing a prayer, or if I needed something because of that branch if I needed something to help me and that branch needed to help me, for example, with whatever, I'd never do it without asking. And that respect for nature, it comes under the notion of a principle that we have, which is called kaitiakitanga. And kaitiakitanga is this principle of being the caretaker, or being taking care of people, but also your world. And when I talked earlier about God's nature, recall nature, anything to do with trees and forests, and that is our God is Tāne Mahuta. And so when we walk into the forest and we behave in a way that is not acceptable or not responsible or not respectful of Tāne Mahuta, we are ultimately being disrespectful to our gods, and that comes at a cost. And it's the same way, I think, how that we see that in today's world. Like, we only have to look around New Zealand at the moment and seeing all the different floods and the damage that is happening around around our country. And I saw just recently, actually, on social media, I can't remember his name, but it was a beautiful post. And it was talking about how our forests and our trees and our hills are sick. It's because they've been so badly destroyed and destruction has happened that they're actually sick and they need time to heal. So when we think about those things, nature is, we ultimately come from nature. And when we introduce ourselves, one of the things I didn't do when I introduced myself earlier, we actually start from introducing our mountain, our river, our land, and that's our structure, for want of a better word, for how we introduce ourselves. We draw connection to our environment first, then we talk about our name last, because that's actually the least important thing. The most important thing is a connection to the land, and the idea when we children are born, and it's actually, I heard this quoted or this talk from a very prominent figure in our world who's passed on, but Matua Moana Jackson, his name is, isn't he? So when he talked about when we're born, the word for being born is whānau. Whānau, yeah. And whānau is to be born, but it also means our family. And then when a mum's or women are carrying us in their womb, it's called hapu. So when someone is pregnant, they're referred to as being hapu, which is basically means you're pregnant. And then when we die, we go back into the whenua, which is our land, but also our placenta is called whenua. So when we're born, our placenta is buried into the ground. When we're born into a family, we're born into a tribe, and then our bones are called koiwi, and that's where the notion of iwi comes from, and iwi means tribe. So we have a family, a sub-tribe, and then a tribe. And so that's the importance of words as well. So whenua, iwi, hapu, and all of that ties us back to the environment and to our family.
It's all woven, like
it's all woven, yeah.
Intertwined. Yeah. There's not a separation.
There's not a separation.
Like usually the Western society see it, that's separate from that. And that thing that's the the rising of the issues that we have today.
Yeah, and I think, and I understand this, but also I don't understand this, is that lands and all of that stuff is seen as a resource, as a mineral, but we don't use that. We don't view it in that way. We view it as we have a responsibility to take care of all of our gods, which is essentially our whole environment. So all of our gods replicate is our environment.
Wow, that's amazing. And also, I want you to tell me a little bit about your mother, an activist, how she was with you. What is the role that women have in your society? Because it's very different than we have in ours.
Yeah.
But at least in Colombia, for more or less when I was born, a lot of women were single mothers, and both grandmothers play a big role raising them. But I think that this is slightly different to how married seeker women.
Yeah, I would say, and again, I'm not an expert, but our women play a really, really important role in Māori society. Of course, there's without women, you can't be kids. But also, and again, this came from my grandfather. He always used to say, if you want anything done, you need to get a woman for it. And it's because, maybe it's because there's the nurturing factor around children, and but also, you know, I know there's a lot of drive there and compassion that comes from our women or from our mums and our grandparents, particularly around making sure that that laser focus on the children coming through is strong. And so I imagine when we had that, I know for me anyway, I remember when my children were born, I was just like, whatever's going on around me can just get. If anything happens, watch out. Just this lioness fire. Yeah. And I think that's something I imagine a lot of people experience. But if we have a look at a lot of the historical land marches or marches, I'm thinking a lot about like Dame Whinakupa, for example, who was another profound wahine Māori or queer or woman in our culture who's also passed on, who led the march down to Wellington. If we have to think about like the language marches, there's a photo there of another grandmother front and centre. So they were the ones who made things happen and got things done. It was, you know, our men did a lot of the talking and what had happened, but it was the woman who made it happen. Yeah. When you go into our marae, for example, you can't actually enter into that marae until a woman has called you on. And so if you don't get called on, you need to wait out the door. And it's quite interesting because I think when we look at our practices, you know, it is quite a male-dominated practice, but what sits behind everything, and nothing can happen without the woman. And so, yeah.
And the schools and stuff, like actually they were the grandmothers and women teaching the kids.
Yeah.
Like a nurturing and then teaching them the language.
The language, yeah.
Of course, they invite men, but the base of everything was thanks to women.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is very different in societies that we push away our grandparents or like elderly people, all their knowledge that they have.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
and I think even just elderly people, like in our society, our elderly, our kaumātua are treasures. And so we always want to make sure that they are taken care of. And, you know, we had a storm here just recently, and after I left where I work, I came past we call them kaumātua flats, which is just a flat area of homes where our elderly live, and it's what we call in to make sure that they're okay. And it's just little things like that, because they're so important. They're knowledge holders. They're the ones who've done all the hard yards to be able to create the platform of which we get to live and experience from today. And they're really fundamental people in our society. And I think for us, when we think about, we're very strong on multi-generational living. And so the cabin that's outside, I know it's being used at the moment as a dojo, but in my mind I'm going, when mum's ready to come home, you know, and if she wants her own space, or if we go out there, like it's not just about, it's trying to build the future so that when we get to that point, we have the option to live multi-generationally. And so we don't like to, you know, even some of how we design our homes now, we're thinking about how do we have homes so that our families can live together, still have our grandparents on site, and you know, but still with their own independence as well.
Yeah.
As opposed to sort of putting them in the fact somewhere over there.
Or
what's in about
home.
Yeah, or an adult. And, you know, granted, there's some families who have to do that, and this is not this is not a judgment on them,
No,
you know, at all.
it's a different way
Yeah.
to see it. But yeah, that's very interesting, different side. Something that I want to ask you is like what it means to work inside a system you are also challenging. It's very challenging.
Yeah. It's hard. I've just spent 14 years working in central government, and that's had its differences depending on who the government of the day is and the different policies and all those things. And it has its good times, but it also has its really difficult moments. But at the same time, I guess that's the work that you've got to do. You know, the work, if it's too easy, then yeah, it should never be too easy. Well, it should be, but it's not. But it has to come with challenge because we're trying to break a very well-oiled colonial system. And so I think being mentally prepared is really important, but also knowing when to take losses and when to push against losses is something I've had to learn a lot. And so I've always had this belief that sometimes, that comes from my grandfather, wrote a book or a paper called Reform from Within. Sometimes you have to be in those systems, get to the reform,
Make the changes.
and make the changes. And I often think a lot about, I was reading actually, it was about the reconciliation versus resurgence. And I'm just trying to remember the author. I know Linda Tuhiwai Smith talks a lot about this, but also F. Tassels, I think it was, talks a lot about this, some different researchers. But the importance of, some people have some being on that whether or not are you working in the space of reconciliation or are you working in the space of resurgence? And I think for us as Māori, we're working across all of that. So I understand. You know, you have to be in these spaces where you're reconciling with the partner or your partners, but also you have to be operating in spaces where you're practicing resurgence. And if without practicing resurgence, you're not getting these groundswells of experiences and things that are working that challenge the reconciliation practice. And so when I'm working within systems where you have to decide whether or not your approach is going to be about reconciling with the other partner or pushing a resurgence is the challenge. But one of the biggest challenges I'm seeing at the moment, and I don't want this to be about the government, but it's just a fact of how it feels, is I guess the threats of, we're going through a process right now where they ran a treaty principles bill, which was a referendum around whether or not we should have this bill put in place, which seeks to redefine the treaty, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, to favour the narrative that we ceded sovereignty. And that hurts, that's hard. And there's just constant Māori, I think, over the term of this government, have done nothing but write submissions upon submissions upon submissions because of the threats to the Treaty of Waitangi, to our language. And so those things still operate. And, when I sit here and I go, oh man, it's hard, it's all of that, I also have to step back and go, 2 generations ago, our grandparents went through the same thing, if not worse. So it's a blip. And we have all of these things where all of these ground root local examples of just continuing to be who we are. And the Māori King last year, or when he was still alive, that the best thing we can do right now is to be Māori. And so that sort of encouragement to just continue to do what you do, is is what I think for me helps me focus over here for a little bit while the system is just having these little issues. Because I don't want to put my energy here.
Yeah.
I'd rather put my energy over here where we're teaching our children the language, where we're practicing and supporting ground roots, whānau or haka tournaments, and we're watching our kids grow. That's the resurgence that I want to focus on at the moment.
How is the relationship with the people from Aotearoa, New Zealand, that is not Māori? Are they receptive? Are they learning the language? Are they getting more immersed? How is the relationship with them?
Yeah. So people who live in New Zealand, or Aotearoa New Zealand, who are not Māori, but very supportive of Māori, we call them tangata tiriti, essentially allies. And a few years ago, and I don't know the stats, I think this was true, but there was a lot of talk around the uptake of non-Māori wanting to learn the Māori language, which is amazing. And when we think about like just recently, like the treaty principles bill, for example, we had a lot of non-Māori come in and support that. The voices were huge. There was a big, massive march that didn't get the numbers. It was powerful. And when we think about, like, we've just come through our local government elections, and there was a referendum that was forced on local government, so that's the council level, by the central government about whether or not people wanted to have a Māori ward seat, which is, for those of you who don't know what a Māori ward seat is deliberately by design seat at the council table to represent the voices of Māori. People don't have to be Māori to stand in that seat, but they have to hold the intention. I ran for that seat. I was uncontested in that seat. I'm in that seat now. But that seat was up for referendum. But our community in the whole of Wellington voted to keep it. And so that was really empowering and really hopeful that our community and those across the country, it's growing more and more. The support for Māori is growing really, really.
That's very important.
Really well, yeah.
That's very encouraging.
Yeah. Hope. Yeah, and I think what's happened is with the way this government has been, it's actually, some people are saying enough is enough. This is not okay.
Yeah. And it's sad to go backwards instead of forwards, and then repeating the same mistakes.
Yeah.
Trying to go to past things.
Yeah.
And just to finalize, in challenging times, what keeps you going? What anchors you? What inspires you?
I think the things that inspire me are, I was talking before about practices on resurgence. I guess it's a number of things and at different levels. I love going to our community events. I love seeing our children running around, speaking our language, to their parents, to their grandparents. I love hearing it. I love seeing our groups out there performing on the stage in Kapahaka. I love the fact that we've got some very intelligent Māori people stepping into wanting to be in local councils, local elections, driving. You know, we've got an election coming up. I love seeing Māori people stepping forward, putting their names forward for positions in our Labour, not a Labour Party, but in different parties across our central government. I think just seeing those little individual acts, because I know behind the individual has been a series of conversations, has been a community support. So with that one person comes hundreds, if not thousands of people. And that inspires me because we're seeing more and more of that, which is probably something that Māori would have not necessarily always stepped into in the past. I just think that when I see those little, well, not little, but when I see those types of things occurring, it just gives me hope that we still, I talked about the blip. These things are just blips. We're going to carry on anyway. It's been 185 years. We've got through these things before. It's just part of the journey. But we do want to get to a point, 2040, which is, if you talk about 2040 in New Zealand with Māori, you all know what 2040 stands for, which is our Aotearoa. That's our aim. It's our vision, which is a different New Zealand, what we're seeing today.
Thank you very much, Awa. It has been a pleasure having you in Science Behind the Glass. Do you want to send a message to the people around the world?
Oh, gosh. Hey. It's just, fight for what you need to fight for. Stand up for what you need to stand up for, but take care of yourself in that process.
Science Behind the Glass is more than a podcast. We are a bilingual platform that turns your research into something the world wants to see, understand, and remember. We produce professional science videos, immersive 360 virtual tours, and real labs and ecosystems, educational explainer content, and personalized coaching for researchers and communicators who want more impact. Visit us at Science Behind the Glass to learn more. Remember that Science Behind the Glass is now on all major streaming platforms via RSS. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, and whenever you listen. Science Behind the Glass is an independent podcast created and hosted by me, Linda Hernandez-Duran, and Daniel Esguerra, with support of our technical director and friend, Rafael Giordano, and original music by Bernardo Arti. Follow us on Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok, and visit our website for more stories and resources. Don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast with your communities. Let's amplify these essential narratives to